Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CLEAR webinar series. My name is Cary Chadwick, and I'm here with Michael Evans, and we're here today to talk about bears. Hopefully you are all in the right place and excited to hear more about today's webinar. A little bit of background. My name, again, is Cary Chadwick. I'm an extension educator here at the Center for Land Use Education and Research. I'm assuming many of you are familiar with CLEAR, but CLEAR's mission is to provide information, education, and assistance to Connecticut's land use decision makers. Our goal is to support growth and natural resource protection. And CLEAR has three main sort of focus areas: land use and climate resilience, water and low impact development, and of course mapping and geospatial technologies. And that's really my thing. I participate in a lot of the mapping activities and research goals here at CLEAR. I also coordinate the geospatial training program. Some of you may be familiar with that or have taken some of our short courses in geospatial technologies. The reason that CLEAR has sort of gotten involved with bears is that, again, our interest is outreach and bringing some of the more technical components of research going on at the university and putting them in the hands of the general public. And so Mike and some of his colleagues up at UConn came to us to help sort of with that end goal, and we'll talk a little bit more about the story map that takes some of Mike's research and provides it in a format that some of you may find interesting. And I specifically got involved in this program or this project because I like bears. And here's an old photo. This goes back more than 10 years now to a previous life where I got to snuggle with bears, and I really enjoy bears, always have. So I had some particular interest in this project. I'm going to let Mike introduce himself. Before I get there, this is the story map that came out of this collaboration between CLEAR and Mike's research program. And we'll be focusing a little bit on the story map as we get more into some of the research that Mike's been doing. So we'll circle back around to the story map that some of you may have already seen. Okay, I'm going to let Mike introduce himself, and then again, as I said, he's really going to take on the role of running us through the webinar and exposing himself to his research. And I just want to congratulate Mike. He just is a newly minted PhD, has his PhD. He's a Dr. Mike Evans now, and so major congratulations on that point, Mike.
Well, thank you, Cary. Good afternoon, everyone. So, yeah, I have been studying black bears in Connecticut as part of this collaborative project between UConn and the DEP for the past 4 years, and I'll get into some of the details, obviously, of that project later, but what drew me to the project was that it focuses on understanding human-wildlife dynamics, which is something that I'm very interested in and think is increasingly going to be important in the world of conservation and natural resource protection moving forward. And then also, I, too, like bears, so this project was, in many ways, a natural fit. And Cary and I hooked up, as she had mentioned, by doing the story map to present the results of this research in an online accessible format to the public, which I've been very thankful for and think is an awesome opportunity to get outside of the academic realm and have what we found have some impact in Connecticut. All right, so the project in a nutshell focused on, as I mentioned, understanding the response of American black bears to development, and specifically different forms of development. As we know, Connecticut is a very developed state, and in many ways it sort of represents a new paradigm for not only bear management but wildlife management. And so before we get too started on, or too far into the talk, along those lines, I wanted to acknowledge the incredible number of collaborators that we had on this project. The research you're about to hear about would not have been possible without the help from a myriad of conservation organizations, land trusts, town governments, and citizens, I think many of which are tuned in, if I'm not correct, to this webinar. So a huge thank you to everybody that made this research possible. And so I'd like to start by just giving, in my opinion, what the three big takeaways I hope people walk away from this webinar with. So if you take nothing else away from anything I say for the rest of the talk, understanding that Connecticut is in fact bear country is, I think, one of the biggest takeaways from this research. It's in some ways obvious, but wrapping our collective consciousness around this fact is going to be very important moving forward. I also want to highlight that things will probably change in terms of the state of the bear population and some of the dynamics that I'm going to talk about. And considering the potential for this change is going to be important. And then finally, with respect to both of those goals, I'd hope that y'all folks walk away with the idea that our actions matter in terms of managing bears and setting up a sustainable future where both humans and bears can coexist. So moving on, we'll provide a brief outline for what I hope to cover. I'm going to zoom out and take sort of a 10,000-foot view first to give a little bit of background about bears and development, this idea that motivated the research. And hopefully that'll set the context for the four main objectives of the project, which were interrelated and kind of hierarchical. So we're going to look at conflicts between bears and people, patterns of bear density, patterns of dispersal and migration, talk a little bit about actual individual movement behavior, and then I'll conclude by sort of synthesizing the findings from these different components and talk about sort of moving forward living with bears. So this idea of the effect of development on wildlife is not a new concept by any stretch of the imagination, but it's become pertinent to wildlife research recently because of new patterns of development, specifically this pattern that I'm referred to as intermixed development. And so if you're a citizen of Connecticut, you're very familiar, whether you know it or not, with this pattern. This is a satellite image of Canton, Connecticut. And intermixed development is basically a pattern of land use by which there's a high degree of interspersion of housing and natural land cover. And so this interspersion, intermixing, essentially creates a very extensive and diffuse interface between development and natural ecosystems. So we're not so much eliminating or replacing habitat as much as we are infusing natural habitat with housing. And so what's being discovered is that this new pattern of land use has some different implications for conservation and wildlife management. So the image on the right of your screen, I think, nicely illustrates the difference between sort of conventional and intermixed patterns. And really what that's illustrating is that this extensive interface creates more opportunities for human activities to impact the surrounding natural environment. And so this has been shown to be corresponding with increased fragmentation, exotic species invasion, altered predator-prey dynamics, and the spread of diseases to wildlife populations as a function of this intermixture. And so this interspersion is effectively creating coupled human-natural ecosystems. And so what's even more interesting is while this coupling we know is detrimental to some wildlife species, we're actually finding that some wildlife benefit from this coupling. And so delineating where different species fall on the spectrum of urban avoiders to urban adapters has become increasingly important to wildlife management. And this delineation and these dynamics are not a trivial matter because intermixed land use has become the fastest growing form of development pattern in North America. So the yellow areas on this map of the US show intermixed land use areas. As we can see, almost all of much of New England is dominated by this development pattern. And if we zoom in on Connecticut, it becomes obvious that most of the state is comprised of intermixed land use. So we studied, as the title would suggest, the effects of this pattern of development on American black bears. I'm going to give a little bit of background about the species. So they're incredibly adaptable and fairly intelligent large mammal. Females usually go somewhere between 200 to 400 pounds. Males will get up to 600 pounds typically. And they're omnivorous, so they'll eat a variety of food sources, but really they're primarily vegetarian. So 70 to 90% of their diet is comprised of plant matter. They undergo this very interesting seasonal life history that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, by which they hibernate in the winter to acclimate to food shortages and change their foraging patterns throughout the year to shift behaviors as different foods become available seasonally. they exhibit a pattern of dispersal known as female philopatry, which will come up later. This simply means that young females stay close to mom when they become independent, whereas males will make these long dispersal movements. So if we look at the range map on the right, the areas in light gray show the established bear range, and as I mentioned, this covers a huge variety of different habitat types, illustrating how adaptable a species bears are. But if we also look at some of the darker areas, and particularly the dots where bears have been expanding, we find that not only are they inhabiting places that are typically considered good bear habitat, places with forest and wetlands, but they're also increasingly found in pretty developed areas where they often become very visible presences on the landscape, such as here in Connecticut. And so wildlife managers are still in the process of understanding what are some of the mechanisms by which this pattern occurs and whether or not this strategy is beneficial or detrimental to bear populations. So I'm going to pause here, and I think it's an appropriate time to do our first poll. I'm curious to know how many folks have seen a bear in the wild in Connecticut.
And it says about 56% of you say yes, you've seen a bear, and 44% have not seen a bear in the wild. Mike, are you one of the yeses or nos?
Fortunately, it took a while, but I'm in the yes category.
Yeah, I'm in the no. As far as Connecticut, I'm still in the no. All right. So I think we're okay.
Awesome. So that's very exciting to me that people are seeing this awesome wildlife species. And as I mentioned, it's not totally surprising. Bears have recolonized the state over the past 20 to 30 years and now have an established range in the northwest portion of Connecticut. So what you're seeing here are incidents of bears damaging property reported to DEP from 2008 to 2012. And this illustrates two things in my mind. One, that bears and people are in fact interacting quite a bit, as our poll results would suggest. And two, that the distribution of these incidents does not appear to be random. So it would seem that there's a clustering of incidents in that sort of interface some of the western suburbs of Connecticut. There we go. And so therefore, the first goal of this research was to understand this pattern of human black bear conflict. So we wanted to be able to identify different landscape features that were associated with the prevalence of conflict. We wanted to try and account for the role of variability in social attitudes in the prevalence of reporting of conflict. And then we wanted to combine this understanding to basically be able to predict and anticipate where we were likely to see conflicts in the future. So to begin this analysis, the first part of this research, we converted those spatial points to basically an intensity surface. So this is sort of how frequently those conflict rates are happening across Connecticut. And we considered then different landscape predictors that we thought might be related to the intensity or the prevalence of conflict. So we considered a set of variables related to black bear ecology, including proximity to forest, the amount of forest cover in an area, things like that, distance to streams, distance to wetlands. And then we also considered a set of variables related to human development, such as the fragmentation of the forest, the density of housing in a given area, and then socioeconomic status as a proximate measure of variability in social attitudes, which we represented by median household income. And so when we looked at all these variables and identified the best predictive model of conflict, those that were important are shown here in this table. And so the two most important variables to predicting conflict were this measure of fragmentation, edge density. And when we looked at what the relationship between fragmentation and conflict intensity was, we saw that there's this linear increase by which for every additional 13% of forest is fragmented, we see an additional conflict per square kilometer. The other important variable was this measure of forest cover. And we found a quadratic relationship, that is, a relationship that suggests the highest intensity of conflicts are happening at intermediate amounts of forest cover, about 42%. So we see high conflicts in places where there's more fragmentation and intermediate forest cover. I'm hoping what this sounds like to everybody that I'm describing is intermixed development, right? We have intermediate amounts of forest cover, lots of housing in between, and a lot of forest fragmentation going on with this development pattern. And so these findings were reflected when we extrapolated these results and produced a map of predicted conflict intensity in Connecticut. And we can see that, in fact, the places where conflicts are happening most often and are most likely to happen are these intermixed areas, the places in yellow on the inset. The other thing this map allows us to do is to hopefully identify future hotspots of conflict. So places that are red on that map that don't necessarily have a lot of dots yet are places that we think are ripe for conflict between bears and people based on landscape characteristics, but do not have an established bear population yet. And so these are places that would be really wise to target for some proactive management strategies. And I'm going to touch back on this idea kind of throughout the talk, but I wanted to first illustrate what some of this might entail. So this is that same distribution of conflicts between bears and people, only now the points are color-coded sort of according to the severity of the transgression of the bear. So green, which is the majority of incidents, 85% of what's reported is bears getting into bird feeders and garbage cans. So far, there's very few incidents of things like breaking into houses, being aggressive towards people. And so what this suggests to me is that there are hopefully some very simple steps we can take as citizens inhabiting bear country to limit their access to garbage cans and bird feeders. And by doing so, hopefully prevent the proliferation of these types of problems. So this conflict prediction is a very useful tool and starts to give us an indication of how bears and people are interacting, but we also still need to know how bears are distributed with regards to these different land use patterns. So our second objective, we set out to estimate the densities of bears across western Connecticut. And we not only wanted to know the densities, but we wanted to distinguish what features of the landscape bears seem to be responding to, and then identify any potential changes in the population structure according to level of development. Excuse me. So what I'm about to introduce was how we addressed this question, and it made up the bulk, sort of the bread and butter field methodology that we implemented for this project. Non-invasive hair sampling is a really cool technique that other folks came up with for studying bear populations. And the idea is we can collect a tremendous amount of information about these animals without ever having to capture, immobilize, or otherwise disturb them. And one of the primary ways that many of the collaborators I mentioned helped this research was by letting me build these hair corrals, which I'm showing here, on various properties in the state. So the idea is we string barbed wire around a set of trees to form a small enclosure. We then put something that is an interesting attractant, smelly, in the middle that bears will come and check out. And as they cross the wire to investigate, some hair is snagged on the barb. We also put cameras at most of these sites, which provided a lot of the pictures that you'll be seeing. And I should mention, yeah, spacing was very important. We needed to consider both the height that bears were going to hit the wire and then make sure it's big enough that they can't just poke their head across, get a whiff, and not ever actually have to cross the wire. So luckily, from those wildlife cameras, we got many pictures, such as this one here of this individual demonstrating exactly how a hair corral is supposed to work. He's crossing the wire, it doesn't harm or impede the bear in any way, and some of that hair from his furry underbelly is snagged on the barbs of the wire. So we spaced these in sort of a systematic fashion across our study area and visited them weekly over 12 weeks in the summers of 2013 and 14, during which time we collected hair and changed that scent lure to keep it fresh. So the systematic distribution was really important because it allowed us to address the questions we were interested in. The grids you're looking at here are going to come up frequently throughout the talk, and that's how we distributed these sampling locations. There was one hair corral in each of the grid cells that you're looking at. And we arranged these grids to sample most of the established bear range in the state, as indicated by the sightings of cubs, and then also to cover a full gradient of housing densities within this range. So we've got our most rural grid, our suburban grid, and then a north Barkhamsted and south grid to span that extent. And so we collected all this hair and extracted DNA from the follicles, the roots of the hair, and we're able to use this to identify different individuals based on a set of genetic markers. And through our sampling efforts, we detected over almost 1,500 bears, comprising 235 unique individuals that we could tell apart based on that genetic fingerprint. We never detected the same individual on multiple grids within a season, which I think is interesting, indicating that they're kind of closed study systems. We added that Barkhamsted grid in 2014, and the other thing to take away from this distribution of places we got bear detections is that it seems we succeeded in catching that southern extent of bear range. So if you look at the southmost grid, detections totally drop off, which is what we expected based on where we thought beforehand the bear population was established. So to estimate density, we used, I won't get into it too much, I promise, a method called spatially explicit marker capture. And the idea here is we can model the location and occasions that we detected different individuals on the landscape as a function of the underlying density of bears in that place and a detection function which models the probability of detecting a given individual. And the really cool thing about this is we can include spatial covariates, so landscape predictors of both of these pieces. And what I'm going to focus on now is our ability to test different hypotheses about how bear density changes as a function of different landscape characteristics. So the blob that just appeared is our 175 sampling sites, our study area, buffered by 10 kilometers. And the idea is with these spatially explicit models, we characterize the landscape in different ways and say bear density can vary between the categories we create and see which one of these characterizations matches most closely with our data. So the first one we considered was forest cover. So here we have potentially different bear densities in green and red areas. Our second hypothesis was some measure of development level. So we had rural, low or exurban, suburban, and then urban housing densities, with bear densities potentially fluctuating between those categories. A wildland urban interface categorization, which measures the level of intermixture of housing and forest, and then a north to south trend to reflect the fact that we're pretty sure bears are still recolonizing the state from north to south from Massachusetts. So without getting into too many of the details, we compare these different hypotheses and models and use a measure of sort of model support to see which one is right or we have the most faith in. And what this table is showing is that the development hypothesis was most supported based on our data. So the detection data indicated that bear densities are changing as a function of housing level and not a measure of forest cover or that measure of interface. We also found different male to female ratios, which is important and I'll touch on later, between our rural and suburban grids. And these were significantly different from one another, whereby there was slightly more males in the suburban area. So we're going to pause before I sort of do the big reveal of what our results from the density estimation was. I'm curious to know what you guys think, what types of development had the most bears in Connecticut. So were there more bears in rural, those low density exurban areas, suburbs, or high density urban places in Connecticut? So most of you said that you thought the most bears would be in exurban, low housing density areas. And you are, in fact, correct. This is an interesting poll because, to me, I wanted to ask this question because the perception of where bears occur, I think, is one of the most important things we need to align with where they actually occur. So as I mentioned, this development categorization was our most supported representation of bear density. And so we saw densities differing between these rural, exurban, suburban, and urban areas. And when we look at the estimated density in terms of bears per square kilometer in each of these categories, the most dense population of bears were in fact in those low density housing areas, strikingly more so than in rural, less developed places. And also of note is the sharp drop off as we get into suburban areas. So despite bears being seen in these contexts quite a bit, the number of established ranges you can kind of think in the suburbs is fairly low according to our data. Kind of a more precise quantification of this relationship, we look at changes in bear density as a function of just continuously measured housing density. And so what I want to draw your attention to is where the peaks in this graph occur. So the peaks here are where we see the highest density of bears, and the range of housing density over which that occurs is from about 7 to 18 houses per square kilometer. Again, reiterating that we're seeing more bears amongst some low level of development and a pretty sharp drop-off in the densities as we get beyond a threshold of about even 30 houses per square kilometer. So sort of taken all together, we're able to estimate bear densities across Western Connecticut using this explicitly defined relationship between bear density and level of development. So the map on the left, the blotchiness is the changes in density as a function of land use context, and the sort of general trend from north to south is that north-south density decline, reflecting the fact that bears are still recolonizing the state. So, as I mentioned, we see that bears are responding to our patterns of land use, the density of housing on the landscape. This relationship also lets us project how we think bear populations are going to be distributed in the future. So given that continued recolonization, we can anticipate places that we're going to see elevated bear densities. Again, anticipating those are going to occur in places with exurban densities between 6 and 50 houses per square kilometer. And so this suggests that along that spectrum I introduced earlier, we think that bears are urban tolerators rather than adapters or avoiders. So they're happy somewhere in the middle. They're not as abundant in places with really high levels of development, but they're more abundant in places with some level of development than totally rural places. And so this, again, that first take-home point that I mentioned indicates that Connecticut is bear country. There's, in fact, a very well-established reproducing population. They're cohabitating with some level of human development, and we anticipate that they're going to continue to expand both southward and potentially increase their numbers as we move forward. Which is a nice natural segue, I guess, to put in a plug for the story map that we created presenting this this research. So everything I've talked about thus far is available to look at interactively through the story map through the CLEAR website, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. You want to show it real quick?
Sure. Yeah, we can zip over to it. And the really neat and useful thing about the story map is if you're interested in what's going on with bear densities or bear conflicts, kind of in your backyard, there's highly interactive capability by which the story map takes you through this research, and you can pull up information about your particular town, the sightings, the conflicts, and that map of density that I showed. So we hope to be adding to this map, incorporating some of the other findings I'm about to talk about as those make it through the scientific peer review process and become part of the established scientific literature. So there's a lot of really detailed, again, spatially explicit information here that folks can, if you're interested, see what's happening in your town. This is probably I know Cary's favorite part, where we can look at the pictures that we got, some of the highlights from each of those sampling sites of bears using the different hair corrals. We got some pretty good shots of bears doing some interesting things. So I'll take a pause here, I suppose, to see if anybody has questions about what we've covered so far before we continue on.
So I did get one question come in. Okay, so if we do things to limit bear access to garbage cans and bird feeders, will the bears become hungry and more desperate and therefore increase things like aggressiveness and breaking into homes?
That is a very good and nuanced question. Most of the other research and some of what I'm about to talk about suggests that bears do not necessarily prefer human sources of food, and that these basically become subsidies to their natural diet. So I don't think that bears are going to become more likely, that is, to become aggressive around people if they're forced to rely on their natural food sources. They are naturally wary of people, and so the idea, in my mind, is to preserve that natural wariness, preserve their instinct to forage on natural food items like acorns and berries and things like that, without creating that association that humans equal food, basically. I think you need that step before you get bears being aggressive towards people. But that's an interesting question for sure.
I think your point, and the well-established fact that bears are very intelligent also indicates that their behaviors will be changed, can be changed and influenced easily if they think that human food is going to require less energy to get than their natural foraging behaviors. And so you're right, I think changing our behavior before they're influenced in those ways is critical.
Yeah, that's a good point. Bears are basically looking for the easiest meal possible. They're naturally pretty conflict averse, and so it's very, very unlikely that their reaction to a lack of bird feeders is going to be to increase their aggressiveness towards people.
We got a few other questions. One is, what is the suspended item in the corrals?
Yep. So that's very perceptive of you. All the corrals, in addition to having the scent lure placed on the pile of sticks in the middle, we also hung a rag, like an auto shop rag that was soaked in that scent a little bit above the corral, and that was just to disperse the scent further and hopefully advertise the corral to a wider patch of the woods.
And then finally, why do you think bear density is so low in northeast Connecticut?
Yeah, we were just talking about this actually. The pattern of recolonization has happened coming north to south from western Massachusetts, and bears don't seem to be crossing the Connecticut River and associated strip of really high density urban development along that river, so not making that move west to east. So the short answer to the question is the population range just hasn't become established in the eastern part of the state. I believe University of Rhode Island has started a similar hair snaring study and came up with very low detection rates of bears all around the eastern part of Connecticut. So that's going to be something that the state and we as researchers are interested in keeping our eye on, certainly. But yeah, the population just doesn't seem to have become established there.
Okay, and then one more question before we move on. Since we can anticipate that bear populations will grow, what are some of the best bear deterrents for us to use responsibly?
Yes, very good question. This is something that I've saved some time at the end to talk about in more detail, but I think most experts and wildlife managers would say that the best deterrent is some sort of barrier to accessing things like bird feeders and garbage cans. So storing trash properly, not feeding birds during the summer. There's also been a recent pulse of commercially available bear-proof trash cans. Anything to limit bears' access to these easy meals is the best thing that we can do to deter bears coming into developed areas.
Great.
All right. So we talked about bear density. And that there seems to be this increase in density around certain levels of development. But what we don't know is how these patterns are maintained or what the effects might be on their population. And so we needed to understand something about the dispersal process, specifically how bears disperse through development and whether or not movement between more and less developed areas is balanced or symmetrical. And these are really important questions in thinking about some of the things that you guys just brought up. Because they're going to give us an indication of how the population may actually expand in the future. So again, we use that genetic data from individual bears, and for those that are interested, we used an expanded set of 14 genetic markers because this gave us more ability to distinguish relationships between the different bears that we detected. So this next portion of the research is all about how related the different bears are. And we're not only interested in how related bears are, but we want to know where they are distributed in space with regards to those relationships. So what you're looking at here is the sort of average location that a bear was detected at. The black X's is kind of their functional, a rough estimate of their activity center based on the places we picked up their hair from, shown over that map of housing density. And so we're interested in the relationship between how close together or far apart closely related individuals are. And so this is a process of investigation known as landscape genetics. The idea here is that we can use this measure of how dissimilar two individuals are genetically, so sort of how far apart genetically two bears are, and relate this relationship to different landscape variables that we think influence the dispersal process, such as forest cover, which is shown here. We were also interested in housing density, how that might affect dispersal and how close together related individuals are going to be. And then highways, which is to me sort of the easiest one to wrap my head around. We can think about a highway as a barrier to dispersal, and so individuals on either side of a highway may be very unrelated, and individuals on the same side of the highway are very closely related. So we have to translate these hypotheses into resistance surfaces, which I'm going to explain here very briefly in 3 steps. The idea here is we convert something like forest cover into this black and white map, resistance surface, that shows how we hypothesize a variable to influence movement. So dark areas are very resistant to movement. We think bears have a tough time moving through there, or move through very slowly, and lighter areas represent that we think the land cover there is facilitating bear dispersal movements. And so we can then measure the resistance between individuals. So the 2 that just popped up are separated by a lot of dark, high resistant area, so we would expect them to be very dissimilar. Whereas these 2, while farther apart, are separated by a low resistance area, and so we might expect that they're actually going to be more closely related. And so the idea is, as I mentioned, we can associate the observed patterns of genetic dissimilarity with the patterns of pairwise resistance between individuals. And the more close this relationship is, the more support we have for our hypothesis about how the landscape is affecting dispersal movements. And so what we found was that forest cover in suburban areas, so we did this, we went through this process for our suburban and rural study areas, had this increasing relationship, so higher forest cover was more resistant to dispersal movement, and the opposite effect of housing density. So increasing housing density in that suburban area was less resistant to dispersal movements. And we found similar patterns actually, although the exact relationship changed in the rural areas. And so what this suggests is that bears are actually making longer, quicker movements through high density housing areas. And so when we looked at combining these different landscape variables to see their relative importance, we found that there were different patterns depending on the context a bear was inhabiting. So housing density was really the only factor affecting dispersal in the suburban area, whereas forest cover and mostly roads were important to affecting dispersal movement in the rural area. So this is interesting in that it suggests different response to roads in particular, depending on what parts of the landscape bears are inhabiting. And then it's also starting to give us an indication that bears are avoiding the most intensely developed parts of their range, moving quickly or longer distances through high density housing. We also, as I mentioned, thought it was important to know how bears were moving between these contexts. So we again use that genetic data to estimate the rates of migration between our study areas. So what you're going to see displayed are basically the portion of individuals in a target study area that likely originated from a source study area based on that arrow directionality, and a relative probability that this is greater than the inverse movement. So we've got our 3 study areas here, 3 out of the 4 shown over that map of housing density again. And so we did this for males and females separately, combining the 2 study areas for males because they were more genetically related. And what we found is that migration was asymmetrical from the more rural areas into those more developed suburban areas. And this may explain why we saw that elevated level of male densities in the suburban population. When we looked at females, which conveniently grouped according to our 3 study areas, we actually found the exact opposite pattern, which was very interesting, because this suggests that the population of bears in and around the suburban study area are not relying on immigration to sustain themselves, that they're self-sustaining and produce enough individuals that net migration is actually out of the suburban areas into the more rural parts of the population. So as I mentioned, this indicates not only that populations are self-sustaining in around those developed areas, but also suggests that we may see range expansion happening most quickly along the interface between development and more natural habitat. Females are dispersing out of these areas more frequently, and individuals are moving quickly through development when they disperse. It's not a stretch to imagine that there may be this shotgun pattern by which bears colonize developed areas and then disperse very long distances through them, and we can anticipate that that's how the population is going to expand in the future. And then finally, this is going out on a limb a little bit more, but this pattern to me at least should be an indicator that we may want to consider the potential for the spread of nuisance behavior. If we have any reason to think that foraging on garbage is something that is transmitted from mothers to cubs, either learned or genetically, and you've got the greatest rates of female dispersal coming out of places where bears are around development quite a bit, that may exacerbate the rate at which those types of behaviors spread throughout the rest of the population. So all of this is giving us indications and suggestions about actual behavior. So naturally, finally, the last thing that we wanted to focus on was trying to directly measure changes in bears' movement behavior. Specifically, we want to know whether or not bears were avoidant or selecting development. And then we wanted to evaluate, distinguish whether bears are perceiving development as risky, as seems to be indicated by some of these patterns of density and migration that we see, or if they're in fact becoming habituated. And so this distinction is really interesting and important because we know that development changes wildlife behavior. And so the more interesting question is distinguishing between these two patterns. So if we think that wildlife is perceiving development as risky, as we know many species do, we expect to see a pattern of increasing avoidance as development or disturbance becomes more intense. On the other hand, if animals are habituating, repeated exposure to development or a disturbance is going to decrease their avoidance response, and so we'd expect to see the opposite trend. And so we looked for these patterns using GPS data provided by DEP. So what you're looking at here is locations, hourly locations from 23 female bears, all from the western part of the state. So each color is a different individual, and each dot is where that bear was hour by hour. So really fine scale, detailed movement data. And what's shown from the distribution of these points across housing density map is that they occupy a whole range of sort of development contexts. So we can use this gradient to address these questions about how bears' movement behavior is changing depending on what sort of landscape they're occupying, and understand something about how they're perceiving development. And so we did this using a step selection function, which I'll briefly introduce here. The idea is at this fine scale, we can look at the observed step that a bear took between locations, so the red line, and compare the characteristics of that step to a bunch of steps that it could have taken that we simulate at each location. And so this allows us to estimate bear's selection or avoidance based on what it was actually presented with for a set of natural variables, and more of interest to this study, a set of variables representing development. So the distance a step was from a local road, whether it ended in a residential area, whether it crossed a highway, and the distance that step was for highways, so indicating how bears are responding to features of development. We wanted to account for some of these seasonal changes in movement that I briefly touched on earlier. So before going into hibernation, as that mom and cub are illustrating nicely up in the left side, bears increase their movement and foraging to prepare for hibernation in a period known as hyperphagia. And so we looked at the step lengths among all bears by month to delineate these three different seasons. So summer movement period, that period of hyperphagia where they're moving around a lot, trying to eat as much as they can, and then fall when they're starting to settle down. And so the idea is we fit our step selection models to each bear in each year, in each season, and then looked at the coefficients that show us basically how they're selecting each of those variables that I introduced, which is displayed here. So these graphs you can kind of think of as a distribution of personality types in the black bear population. So I hope folks can see, I can't see the mouse. Oh yeah. So what we're seeing here is a solid line at 0, which separates the part of that personality distribution representing selection for a given feature and avoidance of a given feature. And the dashed line shows where the population mean falls currently. So what we found is that bears seem to be, on the whole, avoidant of, in particular, those variables associated with housing, distance from local roads, and residential areas. We were also interested in understanding how selection and avoidance may change as a function of different variables, as this is really what's going to indicate whether or not individuals are perceiving development as risky or getting habituated. And so we predicted that females with cubs would be more avoidant than those without cubs, and that we'd see greater avoidance in the summer than during hyperphagia if bears are perceiving development as risky. So looking very briefly at those results, I know these are not the most interesting graphs in the world, but we find pretty strong patterns in accordance with these expectations. So the black squares are bears with cubs, and they were more avoidant of local roads than bears with cubs, without cubs, excuse me. Similar to what we found looking at selection for residential areas. So here the black squares are again bears with cubs. This is measuring selection. So selection for residential areas was lower among these individuals with cubs. And there's also significant changes between seasons that align with our expectations as well. And the final comparison we wanted to make was this idea that I introduced at the beginning of this section of how the selection is changing as a function of the context that the bear is inhabiting. So selection for local roads, or excuse me, avoidance for local roads, what we found increased the more dense housing of a landscape a bear is inhabiting. I show the red line here, the vertical red line, is the peak housing density that we saw bear densities at. So these are all individuals that are inhabiting places with higher density housing than what we know bears prefer. And we see this pattern in all 3 seasons of increasing avoidance the more developed a landscape that bears are occupying. Again, supporting this idea that bears are perceiving development as risky. So these are population-wide trends. And the other important thing I think that I want to take a moment to highlight that came out of this portion of the research is the level of individual variability. So as I just showed, the mean level of avoidance of selection is indicating avoidance for residential areas, right? That dashed line is technically below 0. But you can clearly see that there's individuals on both sides of that solid line. So there's both selecting and avoidant bears in the population. And what's interesting is that this may correspond to bears that are exhibiting some of these unwanted behaviors. So if we look at where the mean of bears in this study that were associated with a high level of complaints fall, that solid bar in the box plot is not only significantly higher than the population mean overall, but falls on the positive side of 0. So bears that are associated with nuisance behavior are among the most selective or least avoidant. So this to me suggests future research and management is going to need to consider not only how many bears there are in the landscape, but we may need to increasingly pay attention to which bears are on the landscape and which bears comprise different parts of the population. So I just spent a decent amount of time trying to convince you of something that I think the bears can show in about 2 seconds here by just looking at their movement data. So we're looking at another satellite image of Western Connecticut, and the red points are those GPS locations. And what we can clearly see is that it's not that bears are avoiding really highly developed areas altogether. We know that they're not. But that in these places, they are restricting their movements to patches of forest that allow them to avoid and skirt around roads and housing. This becomes more clear, I think, when we connect the sequences of these steps, and you can see that most of the movements circumvent the places of highest concentration, like golf courses and strip malls. So in essence, bears are becoming more effective at avoiding development when they find themselves in these highly developed areas. So we found the population is currently avoidant overall of development. We found support that they're perceiving development as risky, and this kind of gives us a mechanistic basis for some of the patterns that we were seeing in terms of the distribution of bear density and dispersal patterns, and that there's this high level of individual variation within the population. So I'd like to talk about briefly some of the implications from the aggregate results I just went over here, but quickly to summarize, for those of you that may have fallen asleep, this would be a good time to tune back in. We found that intermixed development promotes conflict between bears and people. We saw elevated densities of bears in some low level of housing density. We saw that development facilitated greater dispersal, so these 2 patterns are indicating bears are avoiding the most developed parts of their range. And then finally, we saw movement data indicating that yes, bears are perceiving development as kind of risky habitat. So the conclusions that I would like folks to take away from this research and what we've sort of drawn out is that, once again, it's very important to understand that Connecticut is in fact bear country. Bears are around, they've established themselves, and the reason I keep harping on this point is because I think a lot of the difficulty that we may face in having bears and people cohabitate does find its root in attitudes towards, or expectations, I should say, among Connecticut citizens towards bears that are not in line with this reality. And so simply expecting to see bears could shift the way that we react when they show up in our backyards. I think in aggregate, these results also indicate that particular land use patterns are pretty important to not only the distribution of bears and wildlife populations, but we saw that it was important to the distribution of conflicts. And the patterns that we indicated showed that bears are urban tolerators, meaning that there are thresholds at which further development is going to limit the density and viability of populations. And then the other thing that I think may be the most important one to consider moving forward is that populations and the behavior in that population may change. So we think that bears are continuing to recolonize and expand. And we also saw that, we also saw that there's a high degree of variability behavior-wise. And so this, basically, those distributions of personality types that I showed represent sort of potential for different behaviors to become more or less prevalent in the future. And so to illustrate what this might mean moving forward, if we look at a place like New Jersey, which has become sort of the poster child for unfortunate or detrimental human-bear interactions, their current estimate in the part of the established bear range was about 3,000 individuals in those dark red areas. Now I've shown the map of Connecticut roughly to scale relative to New Jersey. And the latest estimate that DEP put out ballparked the population at about 600 to 800 individuals. So this is indicating that the population in about the same area may be in an exponential growth phase, and we could expect to see a lot more bears in the future. The bears in New Jersey, by all accounts, are also more habituated to development because they've lived amongst development longer, and it's possible that that spectrum of behaviors has shifted. So I'm stressing this because I think that Connecticut is in a pretty unique and fortunate position that we are still early on in bears' recolonization process. And so that just means that the potential impact of management and actions that we take as individuals, members of society, can have a really, really pronounced impact on the direction and trajectory that bear populations are going to take, both in numbers and sort of disposition in the future. So from a research and management side, what we're going to try to do is predict future conflict using those by combining our estimates of density and conflict maps to try to see places that we think are likely to experience elevated conflict in the future and maybe target these places for some proactive management, which I'll touch on in a second. This idea of human-induced selection and this distribution of behavior types I've been mentioning, I think is a really interesting and important research question to see how our management actions and bears cohabitating with development may shift the distribution of avoidance or habituation. And then sort of from a community side of things, I think that there's a really high impetus, as I mentioned, to take some actions and create bear-smart communities. So a bear-smart community is an idea that's been put forth by the Get Bear Smart Society. And it basically consists of 6 steps that communities and towns can take to become certified as a bear smart community. Now, not all of these are going to be applicable or feasible in every town, but it provides a very good template and guideline for the types of things that communities that have a bear population need to start thinking about if cohabitating and minimizing conflict is important. And then finally, I'm going to show you the website that has a wealth of information about best practices, but I thought I would also briefly touch on, and this addresses one of your questions, simple things that we can do right now in places that there are bears to reduce conflicts with people and reduce the potential for bears to become increasingly habituated. So with regard to bird feeders, if you can take them down in the summer when bears are moving around, that's really the best option to minimizing potential for that conflict. If you still really, really want to have bird feeders out during the summer, it's better to hang them from a wire that's strung between your house and a tree that makes it less accessible to bears. And then there's some cool sort of do-it-yourself modifications you can make to feeders to minimize the sort of spillover of seed onto the ground, which is often one of the biggest things that attracts bears. So attaching some sort of container to keep the seed where only birds know about it. And then as far as trash cans, as I mentioned, there's starting to be designed bear-proof trash containers that are compatible with automatic waste collection. Electric fencing for folks that have livestock or orchards or beekeepers. And then short of having a bear-proof trash can, properly securing your trash indoors or into some sort of bear-proof container until it's time to put it at the curb. Again, minimizing the potential for bears to come and associate human development with an easy meal. This is basically what you don't want to see happening in your front yard when it comes time for trash day. And that's actually a bear-proof can that was getting field tested. Neither of those grizzly bears were able to get into it. Also, if you see grizzly bears in your front yard, you should definitely call somebody, because that is not what we have going on here in Connecticut.
That actually leads to a question I was asked. Are there other bears besides black bears in Connecticut?
Right. So no, black bears are the only species we have basically east of the Mississippi, and that's what you've got in Connecticut. So I'm going to jump to some of the resources I've been mentioning. The first two are really awesome websites that provide some best practices for, again, how we can come up with bear smart communities. The Living with Wildlife Foundation has guides that you can actually download in PDF form that provide some do-it-yourself projects on how to build simple electric fencing and your own bear-proof cans. So a lot of good information about bear-proofing the home there. If you'd like to know more about this project, I would encourage you to visit our Wildlife and Fisheries Conservation Center website at UConn. DEP, of course, also has a lot of information about bears, including what you should do if you see a bear, how to report that, and best practices for bear encounters. And then we will also, as I mentioned, continue to update the CT Eco and Story Map web pages with the results that I touched on in this talk, as those become part of the scientific literature.
Excellent. I want to thank Mike. He has done an extraordinary amount of work, obviously, and I think it's going to benefit all of us in our communities and the bears. If you guys have any questions, you can type them in now. This concludes our formal part of the webinar, but we'll stay on for a few more minutes to manage any of those questions, and we thank all of you for participating and joining us today for our webinar. So again, we'll be here to answer some questions, but we won't feel slighted if you decide you need to tune out now. All right, Mike, so we have a question that says, does your data suggest that one proactive bear management strategy would be to use a lethal removal of problem bears?
Yeah, so jumping right into the controversial questions off the bat. I'm remiss to suggest lethal management just because I appreciate wildlife. However, I do think that the data suggests exactly what you're saying. So talking to folks at DEP, they'll tell you colloquially that 5 or 10 individuals are responsible for 90% of the nuisance response work that they have to do mostly during the summer. And so I think our distribution of avoidance behavior data also suggests that reducing the part of that spectrum that corresponds to nuisance behavior may be an effective and, at this stage, pretty important way to make sure that the mean population response remains on the avoidance side of that spectrum. So I guess the short answer, without dancing around it, is that I do think that, yeah, more targeted, proactive lethal removal of really problem individuals could be an important management tool to implement now, especially as the population continues to grow, because you not only take those individuals out of the population, you prevent them from propagating and continuing to make up a larger portion of the future population.
And then another question along those same lines, are the more problematic bears gender or age specific?
Yeah, that is a very good question. Our data unfortunately doesn't necessarily address that because we had movement data only from females. Kind of looking through the literature, males tend to be the more risk tolerant or bolder individuals, and I think that looking through DEP's conflict information, you do see an enrichment of male individuals involved in those instances. But beyond that, I couldn't say from our data. And the age thing is interesting. Obviously, dependent bears are not necessarily ones responsible for nuisance behavior, but then in terms of the spectrum of independent ages, I'm not sure that we know anything about younger or older bears being more prone to conflict.
We had a question just stating, would it be possible to post the helpful websites or send them via email? I certainly can do that. And as I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded. It will be posted on our CLEAR website. And I can certainly add the list of those helpful website links below the post. Mike, you can sort through some of the ones that you've had. We've got a lot of questions coming in now. I'm excited that you guys are all excited about this. You want to take any of those?
Yeah, I might pick out one final one here to wrap things up with. Let's see what we got.
I also have one that says, why are bears returning to Connecticut now? Why now?
So that's a very good question, and it combines a lot of different things. So bears were afforded, following extirpation in the 1900s, were afforded protection in most states. So they were not allowed to be hunted until about the 70s. So you've got protection, and then you've got widespread reforestation happening across the Northeast. So the species was protected, and their habitat came back. You've got some forests maturing and producing acorns and hickory nuts and things like that that bears are critical to their sustenance. So those two things sort of intersected and provided a perfect situation for bears to come back.
Just a couple more. With your study, do you agree with the population assessment by DEEP, or do you think that we have more or fewer bears?
Yeah, so I've been collaborating closely with DEP throughout this, and one of the things we were happy to find is that our estimates and numbers more or less match up with the sense that they have from the research that they've been doing.
And then a final question here. Do you think you've gained a sense of how far the Connecticut bear population is from carrying capacity and how quickly or slowly it might be reached?
Yeah, so what I would love to add to this study is some reproductive data to get a sense of, to quantify exactly how quickly we might expect the population to expand. I think the best sense I have is by comparing Connecticut with places like New Jersey or Western Massachusetts, which also has on the order of thousands of bears in a similar size area to Western Connecticut. So one thing we know about wildlife populations is they often go through this exponential growth phase before hitting carrying capacity and leveling off. So if we think that we have even on the order of hundreds of bears now, and places of similar size have on the order of thousands, I think we may be far off from ecological carrying capacity, which is another reason I think it's very important to consider some of these proactive strategies we can do to, if not curb that growth, to make sure that it's not habituated bears that are composing that increased population size.
Great. Great questions. If you have more, you can certainly email Mike. His email should be posted on the screen there, or you can contact him through me, through the CLEAR website. Thanks again, everyone, for tuning in with us today, and remember to come back for our next webinar at the end of May.
Yes, thank you very much.